So these two guitars are 1958 Gibson Explorers, and each one is worth well over $1 million a piece. That's insane. $1 million for what essentially is just a slab of wood, a couple of pickups, a few pots, and some strings. But the question I have is, why? Why are these guitars worth $1 million a piece? And more importantly, why would somebody shell out $100,000 10 times more than once for a guitar? I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I wanted to explore a little bit more. So in order to do that, we took a field trip up to Songbirds Guitar Museum in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, if you don't know, Songbirds is a public exhibition of a private collection of vintage electric and acoustic guitars. It's incredibly impressive, but unfortunately, this week it's closing. It's been open for the last 3 years or so, and for multiple reasons, they are shutting their doors. It will no longer be open to the public. So my wife Tilly and I met my friend Zach Broyles from Mythos Effect Pedals to walk through this amazing collection of vintage guitars one more time.
And all Gibson amps are kind of like, they were designed with like the aesthetic probably pretty early on.
Yeah.
Some of them, you know, the sound is neither here nor there, but they all look so cool. But Fenders, they're very utilitarian, and they just used whatever covering they had for all the cases.
Yeah.
So they bought all that material, like just use it on everything.
I guess maybe too the idea was with the Tweed is like you'd roll up to your gig with your amp matching your case, and it was kind of like an aesthetic.
Oh yeah.
Because that's why they switched to rosewood, right? Fender, because if you look fretboards of the maple, they would get worn out and dirty pretty early on. The idea that I've heard was that gigging guitar players, dudes would roll up to their gigs in their three-piece suits with a dirty looking fretboard. They didn't want that, so they switched to rosewood because it wouldn't look dirty after a couple of years.
Yeah, very, very early 57s.
So this would be black plastic gold top 57. That's theoretically one of the early PAF.
Because the earliest PAFs, they didn't have a sticker.
Yeah.
And then they had like steel covers.
Are those?
And they're not plated.
Or how early is this 57, do you know?
Oh, that's early. It's probably about May or so, because I don't think the humbucker came in until around May or June of that year. So it's middle of 57.
Wow.
But one of the first, early for the humbucker, you know. They started with one. They started with like I think 0100 or 0101.
Right.
We have 102, 103, and 109.
So this is theoretically the second Strat, like serialized Strat.
But if you can get a good picture of that, that's most people never get to see that. That's very, very cool.
They've all got a story, right?
This one was this one's not perfect. If you look between the volume and tone knobs, you'll see a little diamond cutout. Somebody obviously put like a little toggle switch in or something, and it was repaired. This one was actually owned by Lowell George of Little Feet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
We don't talk about that. So this is an OG V. These are worth, what do you think?
At least $500,000. You know.
Because they only made how many of these?
80-ish. You know, it was a massive flop. It was a complete failure. I mean, the Les Paul didn't set the world on fire compared to that, but this did nothing.
Yeah.
Because it was just too early.
Right. Way ahead of its time.
Yeah, and there's something really unique about the Carina wood compared to everything else Gibson was doing. It has a totally different tone. They're magical instruments when you can actually get your hands on one, which is pretty rare.
Yeah, which is not very often.
You know, when you think about it, 1958, 59, that's the era of the fins on the car. You like think about Cadillac, think about all that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Like you can see this riding in the back of a Seville.
Yeah.
You know? So to me, it's like, it kind of makes sense, but you know, this is the populace at the time wasn't ready for it.
Yeah.
But their kids were gonna love it. You know?
So as we were walking around looking at these guitars, I was curious, what is it that drives someone to amass a collection like this? I mean, keep in mind, this is all owned by one person. One man owns these guitars in this collection. And this is something that I personally have trouble relating to because I'm not a collector. I don't have that collector's mindset. I don't feel the need to own one of every custom color Firebird ever made. But the more that I thought about it and looked at these guitars, I realized that collectors like this one are actually doing something incredibly valuable. See, these guitars have really only been around for 50 or 60 years, which in the grand scheme of things is not all that long. But when you look at the role that these instruments have helped play in our culture, in our art and history, not just in the United States or Western culture, but across the entire world, the impact that has been made using these instruments and by the people that use them to write their music has been huge. In many ways, you can look at a 1959 Les Paul the way you would look at a Stradivarius violin. It's one of the greatest examples of that particular instrument that was ever made, and it was played by some of the best players to ever pick that instrument up in the first place. The main difference being Stradivari violins are hundreds of years old, where a 59 Les Paul is less than 100 years old, which means these guitars need to be preserved and documented and taken care of for future generations. From the way I see it, it's like these instruments, they're only 50, 60 years old now, but ideally these are going to be around for hundreds of years, like a Stradivari violin. And so I think an argument for like the collector sort of mindset is you guys are sort of like stewards of these guitars, right?
Absolutely. There's so much history here, and that was the whole point, to put it out there, and people could learn from it. But it's cool. You open up the e-cases, and you'll see a music book from this place. You open up and then you open up the manuscript book and look at the songs in there, and it brings you back in time. But you'll see a set list from a band, you know, with songs from 1961, 62, or the late 60s. One of my favorite stories is the 63 Jaguar here. I'm in the warehouse one day and I'm opening cases, and I get to this guitar. I open up the case for this guitar and there's a letter in it. And the letter is from the gentleman we bought the guitar from. And he's telling the story about how when he was in high school, his best friend bought this guitar. And they were playing in a band, whatever. And then around 1967, I'm not sure if they both, I think they enlisted. I don't think they got drafted. I think they enlisted in the Army. And at one point his friend got called to active duty. So this is the Vietnam War's going on, it's 1967, 68. And his friend gets called to active duty, and his friend says, look, I'm going to sell this guitar to you, and when I come back, I'll buy it back. Then the guy that now owns this guitar, who bought it, now gets called to active duty. So he ships it home to his parents. And then the letter continues. My parents passed away a few years ago. I was cleaning out their house, and I took this guitar back with me to Florida. So now the letter is telling you a couple things. His friend never made it home, and this, it was almost like it was a bad memory. So this stayed in the closet at his parents' house for 40-something years. And then he eventually took it back to Florida. He played it for a couple of years, and then eventually he sold it as he got, on age. Yeah, it's just, there's a whole other depth to it. Besides just the guitar, the people that owned them, and the roads they all travel.
Now, one common criticism I've seen online about places like Songbirds is these guitars should be played. They shouldn't be living behind a pane of glass. They should be out being used and played and enjoyed. And I can empathize with that. And some level, I agree. Guitars are meant to be played and enjoyed. But this is simple economics. When you have a guitar like a 1959 Les Paul or the two Explorers, which we're going to get to in a minute, that are worth so much money, inevitably people just don't want to take them out. You're probably not going to want to take your burst down to a local bar gig when you paid upwards of 200 grand for it. Now, there are cases of players like Joe Bonamassa and Vince Gill and Jason Isbell and dozens of other players that still take their vintage guitars out on the road. But for the commoners, guys like you and me, we can't really afford these things. We can't afford to own the guitars that we might dream of. And I think this has an interesting effect, especially on younger generations of players. I think we're starting to see a shift away from a lot of these vintage guitars and vintage inspired guitars for younger players in favor of designs that are completely different, i.e. not your daddy's guitar. And I think that's totally cool. It's taking guitar and guitar music and guitar playing to a new place and opening it up to a new generation of players. And the reality is, when it comes to these vintage guitars, this is just simple economics. It's supply and demand. The demand is really high and the supply is really low. And so, as a result, you get these astronomical prices.
It's interesting, all the things that are now in vogue that used to be just like a pretty generic used instrument. Like this natural finish tele-thin line arguably is built just as well as a Mexican model, right?
Right.
You know, it's a poly finish using similar woods, similar fret wire. The pickups are different, the pots are different, but blindfolded you could probably not tell a difference. But this guitar now, because of that body shape, because that guitar has become so much more popular, has really gone up in value. And all the guitars that, you know, you think, oh, this is just not going to be worth crazy money, have now become so cool because all the things that were kind of little off kilter, things that weren't super sought after, are now things that people can afford, and those things in turn go up in value. So it's an interesting way how the market is, you know, sees these instruments when they're arguably just as good as what's being made right now from the same company.
Right.
There's about $50 million in this room. These two are extremely rare because they're Esquires, but what's wrong with them? They have 2 pickups, exactly. And how this came about is there was a guy named Verlin Whitford who was a traveling musician who walks into the Fullerton, California factory and asks to purchase a broadcaster that day, but Leo didn't have one on hand, but he was not one to miss out on a sale. So he says, look, give me about 20 minutes and I'll route you out another pickup on this guitar. And in that 20 minutes, he gives them a tour of the factory. And in the tour of the factory, they go to the back room and they were testing out the amps for quality control with this guitar. Turns out this is your first Sunburst guitar ever from Fender. And Verlin liked the weight of it because it's a spruce body as opposed to pine or ash or alder. And so he starts playing it, loves the weight of it, and asked to have this one routed out as well. And so he was on his way with both these guitars. It consists of your Flying V, your Explorer, and there was a third one called the Modern. The Modern was destroyed. There's kind of a tall tale out there that everyone seems to think that Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top has the Modern. He does not. The Gibson guys have been in here numerous times and they tell us that they destroyed it. They didn't like the way it looked. There's so few of these made. These are probably some of our most expensive pieces. They've made around 100, under 100 Flying V's, which we own 10 of. They made about 22 Explorers. 19 exist today. These are probably our most expensive pieces. These go for well over $1 million. We bought these two as a set from Rick Vito. Rick Vito played with Fleetwood Mac for a little bit, and then he had loaned them out to Joe Bonamassa, and Joe played these on his Live at the Greek Theater DVD. But also they had to stop production on them. They were made with a wood called Carina, and Carina was actually a made-up term. It's actually called African limbo wood. I guess maybe Gibson thought Carina sounded a little bit sexier. But it had similar tonal qualities to mahogany, but it was a lot lighter in weight, and that's why they liked to use it. However, the sawdust was carcinogenic, so the factory workers were starting to get sick. So obviously that is not good. So they stopped production on these. Right.
I love that.
How many Explorers did they make?
I'm told 22.
They made 80-ish Flying V's or something.
I've been told 91. That's why I say under 100.
Yeah.
I try to be a little loose on my numbers.
Man, so each one of those is around about $1 million.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, so his Big Ed Thompson's brother was a lefty. So that's why there's the added pick guard.
Oh.
What a weird guitar player.
Yeah.
Totally away, like all the nothing more than a straddle.
Dude. So that's why those Explorers are worth over $1 million a piece. When you factor in the rarity and the history and pedigree behind those instruments, it makes sense, at least to me, why someone would be willing to pay such a high price to own one of those instruments and essentially become a steward of it, to be able to take care of it and document it and share it and pass it down to a future generation. Overall, I think places like Songbirds need to exist. I think they do good for the community of guitar players and educating people like me on where these things came from, helping me understand why I love the music that I love and I love the type of guitars that I love. It's a pretty valuable thing in my opinion, and quite honestly, I'm gonna be sad to see that place go. I got to play a show there before. I was actually supposed to play a show there this past June, but because of the pandemic, that didn't happen. Also, I want to shout out the Songbirds Foundation. That's going to be continuing on from what I understand, even though the museum is closing. And it's a foundation, a charity that gets public schools access to guitars and basically helps to bolster public school music programs, which unfortunately here in the United States, we are hemorrhaging like crazy, and I don't think that needs to happen. So I'll have some information on the Songbirds Foundation in the link below in the description box if you want to check that out. And again, huge thanks to Irv and all the guys there for letting us come by and film and take a look at these guitars to be able to show you guys. If you want to support the channel, sign up for the Green Room, linked down below, where you can get access to the forum and my video courses. I'm working on 2 new video courses currently as we speak, which will be available very soon. Be sure to subscribe here on my YouTube channel and check me out on Instagram at Rhett Shull. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and remember, there is no plan B.